There is a question that has been circling through every conversation about this family for months, and it deserves a real answer. Not the version where Jonathan is a bitter, ambitious son who decided to blow everything up because he thought he was entitled to a title. Not the version where Rachel is simply a loyal daughter standing by her mother. The real question is this: what, specifically, set all of this in motion? Because if you can answer that question honestly, the rest of the story stops being confusing and starts making complete, uncomfortable sense. The answer is not the beach house. It is not Doug Weiss. It is not even the marriage announcement. It is a $100,000 honeymoon charged to a ministry credit card. It is a $5,500 personal photography bill paid with donor money. And it is what happened to the man who was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, depending on how you look at it, to raise those concerns out loud. When Marcus Lamb died on November 30th, 2021, he did not leave his family without direction. He left a documented succession plan. He had communicated his intentions to the family and to the Daystar board. Jonathan was next in line after Joni. Not because Jonathan had lobbied for it, not because he had made himself indispensable through political maneuvering, but because Marcus had looked at his son, evaluated what he saw, and decided, this is the one I trust with what I built. That is not an assumption or a rumor. That is the stated, documented, legal intention of the man who founded the ministry. And Jonathan, for his part, respected it with a kind of deference that speaks directly against every narrative painting him as power-hungry. When Joni told Jonathan after Marcus died to move into his father's presidential office and take the seat, Jonathan refused. He said he would not take that office until God placed him in it. He waited. He served. He continued doing his job as vice president with what everyone around him acknowledged was genuine commitment. And part of that job was oversight of finances. It is documented. It is not contested by the numbers. Daystar TV's own expense reports, obtained and verified by investigative journalist Julie Roys, show that Joni Lamb charged approximately $100,000 to her Daystar corporate credit card for a luxury resort called Las Ventanas al Paraíso in Los Cabos, Mexico, where she and Doug Weiss honeymooned in July of 2023. Two separate charges appear across two expense reports: $36,780 charged in October of 2022 and $60,041 charged in May of 2023. The itemized resort bill shows the total honeymoon cost, including food, drinks, and tips, came to $103,818. Jonathan was vice president at the time. Approving expense reports was part of his actual job. He raised the issue internally, first consulting with the Daystar CFO and head of accounting, who confirmed the ministry credit card did not have enough accumulated points to cover the charges, meaning real donor money was used to pay the bills. Jonathan then raised his objection formally at a board meeting on August 23, 2023. At that point, the board consisted of only 3 people: Jonathan, Joni, and attorney Tom Callender. Callender's response was to gift the approximately $100,000 to Joni from the ministry. Jonathan did not go to the press. He did not post about it. He sent his mother an email. In that email, recorded and since verified, he wrote to her clearly and without malice, "Mom, I have always submitted to you, even when I don't agree. I didn't agree that Daystar paid your $100,000 honeymoon. I didn't agree that Daystar paid for $5,500 of Rachel's photography, personal photography expenses. I didn't agree with Doug being the host of Ministry Now. But I submitted to all of that. The only place I draw the line is the Word of God. I will never compromise the Word of God." Read that again carefully. That is not the email of a man staging a coup. That is the email of a man who had been submitting quietly, repeatedly, and consistently to decisions he disagreed with, who finally reached a line he could not cross, and who communicated that fact to his mother directly, privately, and respectfully. Nobody on the recording disputed the substance of what he said about the honeymoon expenses. And it cost him everything. The $100,000 honeymoon is dramatic enough on its own. But it is the $5,500 photography charge that quietly reveals something even more important about the internal family dynamics. Rachel Lamb Brown served as Daystar's Director of Communications. She is Marcus and Joni's middle daughter. She is Josh Brown's wife. And according to Jonathan's documented, recorded, internal objection, $5,500 of Daystar donor money, money that people sacrificed and gave in faith because they believed in the ministry's mission, was spent on a personal photography shoot for Rachel. Not on ministry outreach. Not on network production. A personal photo shoot. Jonathan raised that concern privately, within the family and the board structure, through the exact channels a responsible executive should use. He never made it a public campaign. He brought it to the attention of those in authority over him and asked for accountability. And the person whose spending was being questioned, and the people protecting that spending, were the same people who would soon have enormous influence over whether Jonathan kept his role at Daystar. This is the thread that, once you pull it, makes the entire tapestry unravel. Because you cannot understand why Rachel aligned with the Daystar board against her own brother without understanding that her brother had already, formally and privately, objected to financial decisions that directly involved her. Jonathan had already made clear, in recorded internal meetings, that he believed donor money was being misused in ways that benefited people in his own family. And once that is understood, Rachel's subsequent position stops looking like simple family loyalty and starts looking like something far more complicated. The most important word in all of this is the one Jonathan used in that email: submitted. He said he had submitted even when he disagreed. He had swallowed his concerns about the honeymoon. He had held his objections about the photography expenses. He had stayed quiet about Doug Weiss hosting a ministry program. He had stayed in his role, done his work, and trusted that raising his concerns through proper channels was the right approach. But there is something almost painful about reading that word, submitted, in the context of everything that followed. Because what the record shows is that a man who kept submitting, who kept deferring, who kept honoring his mother's authority even over serious disagreements, was ultimately treated as the greatest threat the organization faced. The very discipline and restraint that should have identified him as a trustworthy steward became the thing nobody around him was willing to reward. Meanwhile, the spending he had raised concerns about was defended, gifted, and ultimately shielded from scrutiny. The board that should have provided independent oversight made a decision at a 3-person meeting to simply give Joni the $100,000 from ministry funds rather than require accountability. And when Jonathan's objections became part of the growing internal tension around Doug Weiss and the marriage announcement, those objections were reframed not as legitimate governance concerns but as evidence of Jonathan's supposed bitterness and ambition. That reframe became the official narrative. Joni stated publicly that Jonathan's behavior was driven by resentment over the presidency, that he felt entitled and was running a smear campaign because he did not get what he believed he deserved. But Jonathan's own email, recorded months before any of this became public, tells a completely different story. It shows a man who explicitly said he was not withholding submission over the presidency, not withholding it over his personal frustrations, but over one thing only: the Word of God. Many people watching this story have been genuinely surprised by Rachel's posture, the way she positioned herself alongside the Daystar board and against her brother during the height of the controversy. The surprise is understandable if you only look at the surface. She is his sister. They grew up in the same home. They built careers in the same ministry. The instinct is to expect siblings to stand together, or at least to stay neutral, in a family conflict this serious. But family conflicts are rarely about just one thing, and this one is not either. Rachel's alignment with the board did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in the context of a brother who had gone on record, internally, through proper channels before any of this became public, objecting to spending decisions that ran through her. Jonathan's concern about the $5,500 photography charge was not a passing complaint. It was a formal, documented, internal objection raised in his capacity as vice president, aimed at the same financial oversight structure that Rachel operated within. She brought forward messages, reportedly from Susie, showing warm and enthusiastic early support for Joni and Doug's relationship, support that appeared genuine and wholehearted. She used those messages to challenge the later public presentation of Jonathan and Susie as principled objectors who had always held deep convictions about the marriage. That timeline challenge is real and it is fair as far as it goes. Susie's early messages did reflect warmth toward Joni's new relationship. But the question that hangs in the air after Rachel presents that timeline is one she has never fully resolved. Is the concern about when Susie's convictions arrived at genuine theological point about consistency? Or is it a strategic reframing designed to discredit the one family member whose financial objections posed a specific inconvenience to Rachel's own position at the ministry? Both things can be partially true. And that ambiguity is precisely why this story has never resolved cleanly into a simple narrative where one side is entirely right and the other is entirely wrong. Rachel went through the events at the Miramar Beach House in August of 2021 in careful, methodical detail. She described Josh as a father with a fussy infant on his hip, walking upstairs at the invitation of Jonathan and Susie's then 8-year-old son, who wanted to show someone the view from his bunk. She described the little girl following along on her own. She described it as the kind of ordinary, chaotic, multi-generational family vacation moment that looks entirely innocent from every angle she presented. Josh himself gave a detailed account to Colleyville police investigator Nick Garcia, denying he ever saw the little girl undressed and saying he was focused entirely on managing his squirming 1-year-old son while looking out a window. He described the moment Jonathan erupted as completely disorienting, going from what he experienced as an innocent room visit to being accused of something horrifying with no warning and no understanding of what had supposedly occurred. Then there is the account of what the little girl herself said when she eventually spoke about what had happened to her. According to what Joni revealed publicly, the child's disclosure pointed not to a family member at the beach house but to a boy at her preschool, a real incident, a real trauma, but one involving a completely different person in a completely different setting. Josh's name, Rachel insists, never came from the child's own mouth. The child never made an outcry identifying any family member. Colleyville police closed their investigation in May of 2025 without filing charges, citing the absence of a formal outcry from the child. They stated clearly that if she were ever to come forward and identify an abuser, the case could be reopened. Jonathan and Susie have maintained throughout that the original disclosure their daughter made in November of 2020 was far more specific than the publicly released summary suggests, and that the full picture was never properly investigated because the people responsible for investigating it were the same people whose family members stood to be implicated. The forensic counselor brought in to conduct proper interviews, Debbie Leonhardt, was never able to complete her assessment of Josh because Rachel answered questions on his behalf during the session and Josh declined to return for the follow-up sessions she required. Jonathan later learned from Leonhardt directly that Marcus had not told him the truth when he said she had cleared Josh of all allegations. She had not been able to reach any assessment at all. Here is the full picture as it stands. A man raised financial concerns privately and through proper channels. Those concerns were documented in internal recordings. They involved a $100,000 honeymoon charged to a ministry credit card, $5,500 of donor money spent on a personal photography shoot, and the use of a ministry jet for dozens of personal flights that an independent analysis valued at nearly $800,000 over roughly 2 years. He did not go public with any of it. He did not call a journalist or post to social media. He submitted his own word, and then raised his objections internally, formally, and specifically. That same man's daughter disclosed an experience of abuse in November of 2020. That disclosure was handled, in Jonathan and Susie's account and in the forensic counselor's corroboration, in a way that was incomplete, compromised by the very relationships it was supposed to examine, and ultimately buried before any proper conclusion could be reached. The man who kept asking questions about both the finances and the investigation eventually lost his show, his salary, his title, his board seat, his access to the ministry his father built, and his relationship with his mother. He was fired with a termination letter delivered on a Saturday by an armed security officer. And now, with Joni gone and the board reportedly weighing the future, the conversation about whether Jonathan comes back has become inseparable from the conversation about whether financial transparency follows with him. Because if Jonathan returns, the questions he raised do not disappear. They arrive with him. Every concern documented in those internal recordings, every expense report, every board meeting, every objection he submitted in writing, all of it becomes relevant again the moment he walks back through the door. That is the part of this story that nobody on the other side of it has been eager to discuss. It is also the part that explains everything.